Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the state of the Modular Open Systems approach, MOSA, in the Department of Defense. As you know, MOSA is an acquisition and design strategy that integrates business and technical approaches and control of intellectual property and interfaces to try to achieve an affordable and adaptable system by adopting open standards and modular designs. In theory, by implementing MOSA, the Department of Defense can potentially drive innovation, increase system adaptability, and reduce lifecycle costs through, for example, more accessible and cost-effective upgrades, plus a lot of other potential benefits. It's become sort of rote, a cornerstone of modern defense acquisition reform talk, where you can just say one of the solutions to improving defense acquisition is to make more use of MOSA. Everyone sort of says it all the time. But how well is MOSA really being used across the Department of Defense? In our last podcast episode with Ann McDonough from the Government Accountability Office, we examined the findings of the GAO's recent MOSA report, which looked at DoD's progress and challenges in implementing MOSA across various programs. Today, we're also going to discuss the current state of MOSA adoption within the DoD, evaluating its ability to, for example, live up to congressional mandates, its successes, its challenges, and the broader implications of moving DoD to better use more open and modular systems. To help us unpack all of this, we're joined by three esteemed guests. We've got Kirk McConnell, Robert Otis Winkler, and Evan Fortunato. Kirk is a retired congressional staffer who served for 37 years on Capitol Hill, including significant time at the Senate Armed Services Committee. Otis is also a congressional staffer in his former life, also an Air Force officer, currently vice president at Kratos Defense Security Solutions. And Evan is also former government DARPA program manager and currently president and CEO of Apogee Research. These three have worked on MOSA issues from a variety of perspectives, DoD, congressional, industry, and it's going to be great to have you unpack what's working and what's not working. So gentlemen, welcome to today's podcast.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start, Evan, if you could just set a baseline for all of us. Can you just start us off by defining MOSA and tell us kind of what the technical advantages and costs are?
Sure. So MOSA is an architectural approach. So it's a constraint on the set of solutions you can provide. So the two constraints for MOSA in particular are modular and open. And modular means that your solution can't be a big ball of spaghetti. It's got to be decoupled such that I can change one part and I don't have to change all the other parts in response. And open means that you have to publish what it is that you're doing for the modular interface so that other people have the opportunity to innovate and improve and change each of those components separately.
And so I guess at the technical level, I could see the advantages. But if I'm the, let's say, warfighter, why should I care?
So this from the warfighter's perspective, I think the main thing that you get is that capabilities can go out to the field faster and in smaller increments instead of having these big bang block upgrades that can take 5 or 10 years. You can get small incremental updates on a continual basis. And on the flip side, on the acquisition side, MOSA allows you to solve complex problems more feasibly. So if you've got a fixed budget and a fixed schedule, a MOSA approach will get you more capability, if you do it right, than just trying to do it all together as a big ball of spaghetti.
Right. So that this use of open standards, open architectures, then gives that customer more flexibility, right?
I'm not sure that it gives more flexibility as much as it gives the opportunity to have small incremental updates and allow people to innovate within the definitions of the architecture. And that's really the key issue in MOSA is if you don't get the architecture right, you're actually constraining all the innovation out. And I think that's one of the key things to think about when you're trying to design your MOSA is where do you put the modularity and where do you put the openness? Because that's going to drive how much benefit you get.
All right. So Otis, from an industrial perspective, does the word openness necessarily scare industry? Is that something that kind of flies in the face of typical defense business practice?
I think it did, right? So you go back a couple of years, maybe 15 years, And the business model for most solution providers, like the primes, was to give a fully integrated system over to the government. And then they would make a significant amount of money off of the sustainment of that system over the life cycle of the system itself. So it was essentially vendor locked. Whoever owned that system owned the sustainment, owned the swapping out of the upgrading of the parts, changing of the requirements, right? Upgrading of whatever the warfighting systems were integrated, the components that were integrated in. And you own the entire life cycle of that. What MOSA allows you to do is to break that apart and to stop the vendor lock. So now you're seeing the business model change in the defense industry more towards trying to match whatever the open systems are, the definitions, as you said, to figure out ways that you can provide a product and an interim solution as it upgrades, as the system upgrades over time. We're moving now into this new age of commercial, though, and the commercial viability, which is defense industry trying to get in front of requirements. And so I think we're going to go back to the problem of openness here as it fights, at least the openness, and I think we're going to get to it in a little bit, but the openness is what most people think of, which we have one standard, everybody matches that standard, and then we continue on until it's time to get a new standard, right? One standard to rule them all, if you will. I think that's going to fly in the face or come up hard against this commercialization that's going out there, where people like the new VC-backed firms are trying to get in front of requirements and provide a solution faster than what you might get out of the government. And in that case, then you're back to the idea of potential vendor lock of that solution, because their business model is their IP, their secret sauce is built into the solution that they're giving.
Regardless of standards.
Depends, but potentially regardless of standards, yes.
And it's funny because you talk about vendor lock, and from the prime's perspective, they're competing each of the subcomponents on each upgrade. They don't view it as a vendor lock, even before MOSAs came out. And so as you move to these commercial models where you're trying to get ahead of the requirements, as you say, and provide an integrated system, you're going to come back to what looks like a vendor lock at the architectural system. So the real value of MOSA is not just about competing the components, which we could actually do before. It's about competing the architectural elements as well. And as you say, we're actually drifting back to what looks like very non-MOSA-like approaches as we look forward in time.
So Kirk, you've been paying attention for a long time.
Yeah. Well,
and you've heard the debates on this.
I have.
Have you heard any good arguments against taking these MOSA?
Well, I was
approaches?
thinking about this, Arun, and what I would say is that the allegations that have been levied against MOSA are you have more complex security problems, right, with lots of interfaces and things like that. I don't believe that that's true. I don't see the evidence for that. You hear accusations that it's way more complex, it's more difficult to manage. Again, I don't see the logic in that.
But you do have to be a smarter buyer.
You have to be a smarter buyer, but in terms of the people who are actually the companies in the industrial base that are building these things, I don't think that's true of them. Now, there can certainly be, and there is, a lot of confusion around MOSA, but that's a self-inflicted problem that you can also fix just by more carefully studying this. I would say that the arguments against MOSA, the one that does seem obvious and makes sense to me, is that if you implement it incorrectly, it can be worse than not having MOSA. And I think I'm worried that that's the situation we're in, is that people are, in a sense, corrupting what it is that Congress established in legislation mandating MOSA.
Okay, and we'll click on that a little later. But
Yeah.
one of the complaints, and the GAO brought this up, is that DoD at least feels it's more expensive up front to take a modular approach.
I think one of the reasons for that is because we've conflated modularity with a lot of other things. And when you ball all those other things like DevSecOps and different approaches to doing software development, those costs creep in and they're tagged onto MOSA. But fundamentally, MOSA has two requirements. modular, and open. And if you keep it narrow to those two things, MOSA in general should reduce costs across the board in almost every situation, as long as you don't let it get corrupted by all the strap hangers, the other elements.
Evan, you mentioned that in the past it was certainly possible for to compete subsystem upgrades and the like. But in practice, companies built products that were so tightly coupled, both in hardware and software, that it was really difficult for a potential competitor who said, hey, I can build part of this, a better product, for them to disentangle and for the government to extract data out of that incumbent prime to conduct an effective competition. So I do feel like vendor lock was a real problem, and that it wasn't contractors didn't fear competition over the life cycle of the program, just because of the practical aspects of it. So while it was possible, I think it was rarely seen as a real threat.
Yeah, and I would agree that the lack of modularity was the key issue there.
Yes.
In terms of the primes not being able to effectively recompete the subs. It's in the prime's interest to recompete the subs to get competition, to lower the subs costs, to get benefit. So
yes,
you're absolutely right. Modularity is a win across the board. It's the openness, which is what allows the government to step in and do that recompete instead of the prime do the recompete. That's the question. And I'm a big fan of the openness. I just think it's important that we recognize the openness is on two parts. It's on the openness of how the subsystems interact with the framework, and then the openness of the framework itself. Because a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm going to invest my money and I'm going to build a proprietary framework that gives an open API to the subsystems, effectively forcing the subsystems to compete, but protecting them in a non-open way.
Right.
And that's the thing I think we have to be afraid of as we look forward, that we don't slip back into a modular and open for the prime, but not open for the government model.
Well, the other aspect of this is that, every vendor, you would think, their self-interest would be, I love vendor lock, right? But at the same time, I would love to be able to compete for some of your business, right? So on the one hand, as long as you've got vendor lock, that's a great thing. But then you should expect these people to lust after some of the potential competitive work they could do on somebody else's program.
I heard a phrase that applies. MOSAs are like toothbrushes. Everyone wants one. They just don't want someone else's.
Someone else's.
Well, and I think I love that. I think that really is, we've seen that, right? As MOSA gets adopted by different, by the defense industry, each individual prime had their own, or each individual company had their own version, right? Different standard for everybody. So
Like my own operating system.
yes.
That you're allowed to play within my
But only yours. Yours wouldn't be compatible with Evan's in that case.
But there is this trade-off between the wish of homogeneity, that if we all agreed to one standard, then it would get improved competition, versus the reality of heterogeneity, which is that innovation will always drive us to heterogeneous solutions as new ideas come out. When we think about the iPod coming out, or the iPhone coming out, or Tesla charging systems coming out, those were all deviations from the commercial standards of their time. And so if you're going to have innovations, you're going to have heterogeneity. And if you're going to have heterogeneity, you've got to embrace it in any realistic MOSA. Otherwise, the MOSA is simply going to retard and lock up and become, Link 16, become 1553, become something that isn't applicable today.
And I love that. I think that the other part, it's a little bit outside of MOSA, but the idea of heterogeneity, right? And the benefits of heterogeneity all on its own, let alone, the benefits of using MOSA. We should be able to measure that in some way to be able to add value to the fact that we have spread ourselves across a large amount of attack surfaces just from a cyber defense kind of point of view.
Absolutely. From a cyber perspective, I think Kirk is the one who mentioned it. People often talk about MOSAs having heterogeneous interfaces, having these extra interfaces that make it more vulnerable. I think in reality, a MOSA done well makes it less vulnerable, exactly for that heterogeneity argument. And when we look at what the DoD is doing now with MOSA, we see the guides coming out of OSD, the guides coming out of the Navy, there is this strong attempt to lock homogeneity, to consensus-based standards, to be inherent with MOSA when it's not. There is no need for homogeneity for a MOSA to work. And while we do that, that's where the the bad implementations that I think Kirk was referencing can really become dangerous.
So you talked, Otis, that you didn't think it was so much of a challenge to a business model. Maybe business models will adapt, and with the commercial folks coming in, they will naturally adapt. But business models today, the dollars spent are mostly on the sustainment side. In a MOSA world, does this shift things over where you have to fight for more procurements, which are short-term and disposable and maybe get swapped out because of the openness and modularity of the system?
It absolutely should. And it should drive competition on each one of those subsystems every single time. What that presupposes, though, is that the government is the one that's doing that competition,
right,
and is the lead system integrator.
Right.
If you rely on a contractor, that fully integrated system provider, then you may or may not get to the same level of competition or goodness that you get out of competing each individual subsystem.
There is another odd factor here, though, which is that when we think about the profitability of hardware and software, if the software is one-off, it's very not profitable. Hardware is where DoD companies often make the highest profit. Now, in the commercial world, software is very profitable because they can build it once and then sell it to 1 million people. Yeah. But in the DoD, that sort of every aircraft has its own mission. Every ship has its own mission. When software can't be commoditized, you can't make real profit on software. It becomes your low profit things. So often the primes are very interested in, at least the ones I've talked to, are very interested in focusing on the hardware sales and the hardware maintenance costs because that's where they make the higher profit. And MOSA can give them the ability to focus on hardware revenue, which is higher profitability, rather than one-off software revenue, which is actually a distraction in a lot of cases.
So Kirk, I want to go back to your role in this, and there's been congressional discussion of open systems and interoperability and key performance parameters and things like that for a long time. But really the action picked up around the FY17 NDAA, and you were one of the staff people, and Otis, you were probably there at the same time, working on some of the National Defense Authorization Act language requiring DoD to make more use of MOSA in weapon systems. And to tell you the truth, GAO indicates that they've been only sort of successful in living up to those mandates. So from the perspective of folks who were there present at the creation of this, what was it that the committees were really trying to get at with those mandates, and why at that time did you think the law was necessary?
Well, first I would like to say that Bob and I were on the Senate Armed Services Committee. My recollection is that the FY17 mandate, that's very strong language around MOSA, actually was first in the House bill. But the original intent was focused on this idea of avoiding the vendor lock or breaking vendor lock. It was with the hope that you would get more competition throughout the life cycle of a program. The hope was that you would find it much easier to upgrade a system in a reasonable amount of time instead of waiting for these mammoth block upgrades and so on. So that was the original intent behind the MOSA push. But I think that did change and later in the FY21 NDAA. I think the Section 804, which was the major piece in the FY21 NDAA, was focused on how do we achieve interoperability? How do we enable the government to take modular systems and integrate them into systems of systems, right? To combine things in novel ways. And this relates to the JADC2 imperative. So those are slightly different things. Now we value this idea of modularity and around the interfaces especially, that's where you're really going to get, we hope, a tremendous benefit out of this.
Yeah, if I remember right, the way I think about it is the 27 NDAA kind of was standards based, right? It went down this road of where we must have standards, right? And everybody will then abide by the standards. It's the one standard to rule them all kind of way. And then when we got to the 21 NDAA, we reset to that, and that standards weren't the right answer. Right? It's not necessarily a bad answer, but it certainly doesn't allow for the backward compatibility, right? For the existing systems. It would mean that every single time that you switch standards, you'd have to buy all new stuff again, right? Which is not the way that the DoD does it. Just everybody loved to use the USB example, right? We need the standards like USB. Well, great, USB-A, USB-B, now USB-C, right? Thunderbolt, you pick it. They're all different standards. And you run into that same thing when you look at MOSA. So the 21 NDAA took a look at defining interfaces. And I'll let Evan go into the technical details of that. But I think that is really what changed the game, because you didn't actually require standards. All that you required was to describe how your system or your subsystem or your widget or your software was going to interface with the larger system. And it allows then really novel approaches to combine disparate systems, disparate components, disparate software to get to the system of systems idea that is what was going to be required in warfighting.
Arun, I would like to add here that what happened between FY 2017 and FY 2021 is that Evan Fortunato, as a DARPA program manager and performer, invented a method for, under Stitch's program, that it was like a miracle to be able to make two systems that had been designed with no common standard, indeed no standard at all, to be made interoperable in a short period of time if you could have a good characterization of that interface. So this, in a way, just changed the world from my perspective, and I believe from Otis's as well, that this was a technological advance that no one had foreseen. And what it meant was this impossible quest for a universal common standard to impose on everyone in the interest of interoperability was no longer a necessity. And we need to abandon it.
So Kirk's comment sort of points at something that'll be interesting to go back and ask GAO about, which is the use of MOSA as a new acquisition for a total weapon system. That we're going to build this new weapon system and we're going to start from a MOSA principle, I think is still struggling to catch on. But the flip side of that, which is we've got a lot of capabilities that are in the fighting force today. Can we MacGyver them together post-fact to build integrated capabilities with what we've got? I think that's actually flourishing in a lot of ways. You see that happening time and time again. And in fact, a lot of our approach to building systems has moved from that integrated program plan that starts from requirements and then leads to a design that leads to development to what do we have, can we, for lack of a better word, stitch them together to make something real. And so it'd be interesting to ask GAO if they have evidence of that catching on, which is a separate model of acquisition.
Where would you see that? Contracts being let and contracts being terminated? What would be the signature that that's happening?
The signature is that you're building kill chains from systems that were not built to any standard. So that, you know, a Boeing airplane and a Navy missile and a Army, you know, radar are suddenly part of a kill chain. And, you know, that's, I think, the sign of success for what Evan invented.
And I think that the one of the other signs of success is when the MOSA standards integrators use this same technology to do backward compatibility with their own standard as they continue to move forward. Right? That's how I think, that was my big light bulb of this is changing the game.
For example, these consensus-based standards, we're all familiar with OMS in the Air Force and FACE in the Navy. But, you know, OMS has struggled. This is a consensus-based industry standard that everyone applauded and thinks that's the model. They have backward compatibility problems all the time because the latest version, which incorporates newer capabilities and features, is suddenly not compatible with the earlier versions. So, and I think what Otis is alluding to is using tools like Stitches, they're using those to make those consensus-based standards still work and make them backward compatible.
And if you look at something like the Marine Corps' TAC system, the Tactical Assault Kit system, that's a really great example of what I think is a MOSA done right. It leverages a commercial standard COT, but that's a starting point. It's a nugget to start with. And then it branches off and it changes, and it's open and it's modular, but it's not prescribed. Each team does a different thing, and there's massive amounts of heterogeneity in it. And the result of that is everyone can innovate at full speed. Everyone's running with scissors. And it all comes together because of that modular design from the beginning and that open requirement from the beginning. They won't let something in if it's not modular. They won't let something in if it's not open. And that leads to efficient innovation. It leads to rapid deployment of capabilities.
But you're describing a set of activities occurring simultaneously across a lot of different programs.
Yeah.
And in general, we don't manage a suite of programs that way. Even a PEO who has a bunch of program managers working for him
Or her.
has difficulty, whether it's a him or a her, getting them all to sort of sing off the same sheet of paper because of the kinds of things you were talking about, right? The legacy systems and dealing with this contractor versus that contractor. Are you describing sort of a different approach then to manage programs to let this naturally flourish? And it's nothing natural about it, right? It's directive from above. I'll add on to that then. Fine, you change your wiring diagram. If you don't change the way money flows, you're not going to change anything here.
You want to jump in, or you want me to?
So I'll start. And
Yeah.
then so I think that foremost is the reason why you needed it in law. Right? So you had to write this into law and codify it in law so that you get that push down as a regulatory guidance to push down to all the different PEOs and to build it into the culture. But what I've seen is that once you get over the not invented here part, right, there is a lot less antibodies in adopting because it helps, right? It actually solves problems for engineers, and after they get over the fact that, well, we could have invented this, right, and they get over the initial antibodies of, well, I know what this is and it won't do it because of X, Y, or Z. It won't work because of A, B, or C. They get over that. They actually see it demonstrated and explained to them. It is widely supported.
Yeah, and I would echo your comments that if right now we believe the way you have to manage that portfolio is by a top-down establishment of a global standard, consensus-based standard, commercial standard, industry standard, to force everyone into alignment, because there's no way to get alignment later if you don't. But that's not the case anymore. Once you've got the tools that you can allow the different heterogeneous approaches to flourish, and the ones that are doing well, you then post-fact integrate, and the ones that are doing poorly, you cut. That facilitates an entirely new way of doing management that's much more consistent with how we see the commercial world handle this problem. When the commercial world comes up with standards, they fight it out, and the ones that don't do well die, and the ones that do well succeed and establish themselves, and then they're hard to displace. But new innovations come out, early adopters pick it up, and we don't have VHS anymore. We don't have DVDs or Blu-rays anymore. Everyone's gone to streaming, even though those were very good modular open standards long ago.
Right.
And so we need to give our PEO, our program managers, the tools they need to facilitate this management of heterogeneous activities, instead of having their only option be to force everyone into homogeneity, which is what we're doing today, and it's why we've got a problem. And so in some sense, the law gave a set of tools, but I'm not sure it pushed them in the right direction enough.
Right. So the other question about the legislation, both rounds of it, was what was the enforcement mechanism? It was you shall do this, and then what if they didn't?
Isn't that always the problem? That's always the problem with legislation. If they misinterpret it, if they don't understand it, or if they just, malicious compliance or no compliance.
Right.
We
always had Arlington County Police on speed dial, right? We could call them up.
That's right. Arrest
Say
that man.
someone-
Go after the PEO.
Right. So the answer is it doesn't work.
The department has reacted, right, to technical changes, commercial drivers, congressional language. Even recently, there is a set of documents that's been produced by OSD, by the Navy, by the Service Acquisition executives, all in my view, looking like they're trying to promote the idea of MOSA. So I don't know if you've all had a chance to look at some of these things, but what do you think about this round of, hey, here's some guidance on how to do this?
I think they're definitely promoting something that's called MOSA. I'm just not sure it is MOSA, because they put into it this tenet of homogeneity, this tenet of a consensus base, a global standard to rule them all. And that shouldn't be part of MOSA. That's something you could choose to do or not choose to do. I think that's a bad thing, but it's not part of MOSA. It's not part of the law. The law says that if you've got an existing standard and it's suitable, you can use it, because we're not going to replace the whole fleet. But otherwise, you have to do this different approach of machine-readable, open, modular interfaces. And that's what these guidances are not doing. They're not acknowledging this second path that's now available that the law says, in fact, they should use unless they've got some sunk cost with a legacy standard.
Yes, and instead, the guidance is go develop a consensus-based universal standard and apply this. And that was supposed to be the sort of secondary option in the 804 language from FY21, and instead it is pretty much the only path to being judged MOSA compliant in these recent pronouncements from the department.
In the Navy, it's explicit that it's required.
So, Otis,
I think that people end up, their measure of merit is, are you WOSA? Are you MOSA? Right? Check the box. Yes, I'm doing that. Okay. Right? Whether it's the weapon systems one, it's FACE, OMS, right? Regardless, right? I'm using MOSA. So I check the box. As opposed to actually trying to measure the efficacy of what they're doing. And I don't think that happens. But instead, it's easier to put out a brochure that says, go do MOSA, go do good work. And nobody measures to what end, right? As opposed to, if you define the architectures, it's very easy to measure to what end. You get a much better measurement of value and a return on investment by going after it this other way, as opposed to just being able to check or table slap and say that, we're doing MOSA.
So make it a little more real. Take a big mission set like missile defense, right? A Golden Dome kind of thing. Who's responsible to develop that architecture? And then who's responsible to make sure contractors are delivering things to meet that architecture? And who's responsible to check up on the system as it evolves over time?
So in the old way, right, and the way that the OSD pamphlet and the Navy pamphlet talk about it, right, you would need some kind of maybe a portfolio manager. So you'd have to give it to an agency. That agency would have authority to set up the architecture, the modular systems architecture, that everybody would have to abide by.
It would find its way into contract requirements.
But first, you'd have to form the consensus-based requirement
itself,
and
yes.
standards that architecture is going to be based on. So before you could move out on an architecture, you'd have to do all this grope around what it should look like. And that's got to include government and industry and academia. And it's just going to tie your hands up.
And it limits the innovation that you can have as you're moving forward with the system. You will have defined the outer boundaries of that architecture to the end. What we're talking about here is not doing that, right? Instead, you integrate it as you go.
Yeah.
Because now you have the ability, as long as you've defined how you interface with somebody else in your systems, you can just interface as you go. Nobody has to. There isn't some big cabal in the sky that gets to put their finger down and say, this is the architecture we're going to use. The architecture is heterogeneous, it's amoebious, right? It moves around, it can actually flex to the enemy, it can flex to the resources, it can flex to new innovations that are coming in. And that's, I think, how you get after something like Golden Dome. Not with the idea that, okay, we're gonna table slap that this is the way we're gonna do the architecture for something that maybe will hopefully be with us for a long time, and will change and grow probably 10 times in that life.
Is that too much discipline to ever expect from multiple PEOs and multiple services and potentially agencies?
I think it's less discipline.
Yes.
is required. It's like you can have decentralized activities taking place. But the key thing is, and Evan said it earlier, is it open? Is it modular? But recognize that to be open, you have to be publicly delivering to the government your interface definitions. What passes across that interface? Both in terms of all the parameters of syntax and functionality and so forth. Characterize your interfaces and keep them in a repository so that the government can reuse them and industry can access them.
And
this is the small government approach.
Yes. The distributed government
Yes.
approach, where there's an actual partnership between government and industry. And I'll just make one technical refinement on what Otis said, which is that the
Thank God,
architecture
by the
that the architecture has to be able to flex. And you described it sort of as an amoeba. But at any given instance for this to work, there's got to be massive levels of specificity of what you're doing right now. Otherwise, you end up in this hard soup where nothing actually works and engineers can't do their job. And that's really the trick to this, is having something that's very, very precise and very, very narrow, but you can easily move from instance to instance. That's what gives you that flexibility, where you can then let all the people who have good ideas that the government has deemed are good ideas that are likely to be relevant start maturing out their capabilities, start proving out their capabilities. And then the ones that prove out, you figure out, how do I do small adaptations, then integrate to make an MVP, a minimum viable product today, without committing to that architecture forever. And then when the next innovation comes out, you say, okay, that replaces this. I need to add in this little bit. Who can do this little bit? You compete it, and then you reintegrate it a year later. And every year now you're getting a different instance emerges without losing all your prior investment. And that's why I think we all think this is actually less discipline. It requires less foresight. It requires less planning. It requires less Karnak omniscience that we don't have. And the DoD has proved time and time again.
Predicting the future.
Yeah. DoD is not good at predicting the future.
Right.
Humans are not good at predicting the future. Let's stop doing that.
And if there are NDI member companies who want to live in this future that you're talking about now, where can they find the friendliest faces? Who gets this?
On the government side or on the industry side?
On the government side.
I would say the Marines are definitely the ones that are friendliest. SOCOM.
Have fledgling MOSA going on?
More than fledgling, I would say. They're actively working to take existing capabilities and, again, for lack of a better word, stitch them together into a modular open system architecture. It's not that it was pre-designed as a modular open system architecture. It's what emerges naturally when you're doing this right. And I think that's what 2021 Section 804 really tried to give the DoD, an ability to take what we've got, add new things, and then reintegrate them instead of doing a top-down dictate.
Could I emphasize what Evan said? We were absolutely thinking about how in the world are we going to take all of these wonderful programs, systems that we've built over decades, spent a lot of money on, how can we recombine them, stitch them together into a system of systems and conduct operations that are joint, all domain, cross service, and so on, right?
You guys were selling then performance and meeting the future threat, and actually not really focused on cost and reducing sustainment costs. That wasn't your primary driver.
Not by FY21. It was an operational imperative to get our stuff to work together, to enable that to be applied to
and then to Otis's
new
point,
problems.
this also enables you to embrace more commercial innovation.
Yes, without restricting everybody to using a particular set of standards.
Or to only using commercial, because sometimes the DoD has some special variant of the problem. So when commercial standards apply, grab them and use them just like you would use any other local standard. Heterogeneously stitch it in, and then add some new standard for the piece that's missing.
So hard to argue against these things, yet it's been nearly 10 years since the 2017 language. It's been much longer than that since this was technically feasible. there's some reason why this is still hard. So let's pretend you guys are big, important people in the Pentagon. What would you do?
I'll let you answer this one.
What would you do now to drive these things forward, right? There's memos, there's directives, there's training at DAU, there's congressional language. From a Pentagon perspective, how do they make this happen?
So I actually think it's relatively simple, and the fact that you have the law, right? The publishing, the mechanism to publish your interfaces, right? To define, but then publish the interfaces is, I think, the one thing that, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a big lift for DoD, but some mechanism to do that where other people can have access to.
It's a shared but controlled access database.
Yeah.
That's accessible by PMs and PEOs and the S&T community and contractors, appropriate contractors. And so it's published, and
It was in the law, but I don't think it's really happened. It's happened in small pockets, but there's not been instead of making the top-down push to force the creation of these repositories and force acquisitions to define where they want modularity and then publish it, the push is on creating the global standard and then forcing everyone into the global standard.
And I think too that the other thing that the DoD should embrace at some point is there are times when you want the government to be the lead system integrator, to be able to make those decisions, to decide what components are going to go where, for your overall system. And we keep making steps in that direction, and then we go back to, we'll let the OEM decide, right? We'll get a vote in it as the government, but we'll let the OEM decide because there's risk associated with it that you're going to be pushing off on that the government may not be willing to buy at that point, right? I think that we need to actually grow out that workforce, the government workforce, to be the LSI.
Grow the acquisition workforce.
Grow that specialty, right?
That technical
skill
part
set,
of the
yes,
acquisition workforce.
right? I'm not saying that you don't need to add more people to do this, but you do need to take people that have the capacity, the training, right, and the experience to be a lead system integrator. Right now, almost all of that resides inside the commercial landscape.
But somehow what we have to break through is this shared assumption across all of these publications, for either the Tri-Service Letter, the OSD MOSA guidance, etc., is that the default position is to start to develop a consensus-based universal standard for whatever it is you're working on. And unless and until you get the department to understand that that's not what was the main objective of 804, we're stuck.
Yeah. So Kirk, then on the congressional side, then a lot has been written. What would you have the folks
to
on the
try to
Hill
find
do
a
next?
way to reframe the language so that the intent is even more. We thought it was clear. Obviously, I guess we failed.
Join the club.
Yeah, but to try to make it clear to people so there's no mistaking the meaning that the primary thing we were after was define your interfaces and make them available to the government, not waste time trying to and fruitlessly wasting time trying to get everybody to agree to a set of standards. And I will say this: I can't identify them. I can't put my finger on who these people are, but I believe that there is a kind of standards community out there that just can't get over this idea that the only way to solve this interoperability problem is by adhering to a standard. And I think that you get a certain point into the acquisition process, and that community says, you gotta have a standard, and this doesn't comply with the standard, so therefore you're not compliant with MOSA, and therefore you're done.
Right. It's easier to do oversight and check compliance to a checklist, to a standard. You're describing behaviors that require this slightly more intelligent customer and a little bit of I know it when I see it environment.
and faith that this is technically possible.
And the added challenge is that you can't ban consensus-based standards because lots of the fleet use them. And you can't ban emergent standards because sometimes a good standard comes out and you want people to have the freedom to use it if it applies to them. And since you can't ban those things, you're forced into a situation of judgment where somebody has to make the call of, is it worth replacing this old standard that already exists? Do I fix that? And this new standard that's emerging, is it worth using it for the duration of while it's valid? But you can't substitute judgment with law.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way around that.
There's some language in the draft Forge Act that looks at MOSA, makes some adjustments, I think, to the old language. Where do you think that kind of language should go as it's trying to push? One of the big pushes in Forged Act is to bring in more commercial innovation, right? So if you're really trying to push on the commercial innovation side, is it basically this idea that stop pushing on standards and just pushing on published interfaces?
Well, certainly if you've got a consensus-based standard in the DoD, that's going to lock out a bunch of commercial players. And even broader than that, what you're going to do is only the people in the DoD who can influence standards, i.e. the government and the big companies, can actually play. Little companies are locked out, commercial companies are locked out. So the first thing you would do is you've got to get rid of that requirement on consensus-based standards. But you can't then replace that with a requirement of commercial or industry standards, because that will yield an equivalent problem. You need to give the flexibility to use standards where appropriate and standards where not appropriate.
Right.
And until we undo this lock anywhere, we'll always end up in the same problem, that he who controls the standard controls the capabilities and everyone else can't play, which I think is what they're trying to get away from. They want to open up that competitive market and allow commercial-based companies to have easier entrance. But they're not going to recode to DoD standards. That would make no sense for them commercially. And you don't want the DoD recoding to all their standards. That would make no sense. So you've got to allow this heterogeneity. It is the key that unlocks this thorny problem. It doesn't solve the whole thing, but without it, you can't unlock the problem.
All right, last question. I guess I'll ask each of you. Are you more hopeful than you were in 2017 and 2021, or is it almost time to give up on this?
I don't know. In some ways, I am disillusioned that we haven't made more progress in constructing system of systems of the equipment and systems that we have today. We should be much farther along on the JADC2 problem based on that legislation. If it had gone right, we'd be much further along. So I am heartened to hear from Evan and some others that quietly, in the background, some progress is being made on this. I've been out for a year. I haven't noticed it yet.
So Kirk's disappointed in his children, but he hasn't given up on them yet.
Which is nice.
How about
sure
you?
How about you, Otis?
Otis?
I'm actually very optimistic, right? You have to take everything in perspective, I think. So I'm not overly optimistic, but am seeing progress where things are moving. I think that we're still trying to get after this standards-based approach, right? But I think that when you get underneath the standards-based approach, this idea of interfaces, publishing the interfaces, and then combining the interfaces at the subsystem level is really taking hold across many different weapon systems. And now I think you're seeing it grow out. I think that other companies are utilizing it when they look at large, aggregating a lot of different sensors and effectors to provide air-based defense and things like that. I think that you're seeing the ability to aggregate those disparate systems utilizing this idea of published interfaces. So we're not to where I had hoped we would be after we published 804, but I do think that we have a groundswell of people going, this makes way more sense, and we've got early adopters that are moving forward with this. So I think there's potential for.
But now they have an uphill climb with all this recent guidance, this tri-service letter,
Makes it much
OSD
harder.
guidance.
No, I agree.
It
doesn't mean that we won't take steps back, and I don't. So it goes to your point of like what is causing this.
We're making this harder than it should be.
Yeah, it's
But what
essentially you're
drove
shooting at
all
the
of
10-year-old
these?
target, right? So
Yeah.
let's stop shooting at the 10-year-old target and let's adopt the technology that's available today.
Evan, hopeful?
I think I'll echo Otis's comment that I was more hopeful 4 months ago than I am today. As Kirk said, there's lots of evidence that, through the rebel activities on the ground, people are starting to do this, and more people are adopting it. And it's going from the small companies to bigger companies to some of the large primes to some of the key organizations. We're seeing this sort of grow out more and more, this approach of bringing systems together. But as this interaction just commented, in December when the Tri-Service memo came out and the OSD memo guide came out and the Navy guide came out, all basically prohibiting those approaches. I think that really makes it tough. I think that's a major step back. And so I think the new administration is going to have to look at the guidance coming out of the previous administration and ask, was this good guidance? Was this the right guidance? Or maybe it was off guidance, and see if we can course correct a little to at least put it on more neutral grounds, if not the original favorable grounds that it sounded like was the original intent.
Yeah.
If that happens, I'm hopeful again. But this current guidance is definitely scary.
With that, Kirk McConnell, Otis Winkler, Evan Fortunato, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank
Thanks for
everyone
having
for
us.
joining us on Emerging Tech Horizons. Please email us at eti@ndia.org if you've got ideas for future podcasts and podcast guests. Visit ETI and NDIA's website to sign up for our mailing list, see what our events are, register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series, where Dr. Fortunato actually is in an upcoming webinar going to teach us MOSA 101 following on this podcast. Want to preview August 27th through 29th at the DC Convention Center is NDIA's Emerging Technologies Conference. We're working with DoD, we're working with UCOM, AFRICOM, the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering and Acquisition and Sustainment, as well as a whole host of NDIA divisions, including our new data analytics division, to put together a really good program where I guarantee you the word MOSA will be used many, many times. Stay tuned on our website. We'll be having a sponsorship, exhibitor, and registration information soon. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to like our episodes and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available on YouTube and everywhere you can get your podcast. Special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this podcast. Thanks again for joining us on Emerging Tech Horizons.